It's going to hit the fan pretty soon. That's how a friend of President Trump described the special prosecutor's investigation. To Vanity Fair's Gabriel Sherman, people close to the president believe that the investigation is reaching what they call an inflection point soon. And, quote, Donald is very worried, according to a Republican close to the president. Trump allies reportedly view the legal cloud hanging over Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen, as at least as ominous as Robert Mueller's investigation. Michael Cohen has told friends that he expects to be arrested any day now, according to a source close to Cohen. Reached for comment, though, Michael Cohen wrote in a text message to Gabriel Sherman, quote, your alleged source is wrong. But the idea of Michael Cohen flipping and cooperating with prosecutors still has Trump advisors super worried. Trump should be super worried about Michael Cohen, a former White House official said. If anyone can blow up Trump, it's him. And BuzzFeed News reports that some Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee want to interview Ivanka Trump as part of their committee's Russia investigation. That follows a BuzzFeed report that found that Ivanka Trump was in contact with a Russian weightlifter during the presidential election who offered to connect her father to Vladimir Putin in order to facilitate a Moscow Trump Tower. Ivanka Trump connected the weightlifter to Michael Cohen, who was then working on a Moscow Trump Tower project at that time. Joining our discussion now is Jill Wine-Banks, former Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and MSNBC contributor, and John Heilemann is still with us. And Jill, the worries about Michael Cohen seem to be mounting, and I think any lawyer out there thinks, yes, if one of your former personal lawyers is being investigated and raided by the FBI, you really should be worried about that.
He really should be worried, and especially because less than 0.05% of all the documents seized had anything to do with legal representation. So there's not very much attorney-client privilege.
The special master who's been going over all these documents to try to preserve or hold some that should be protected by attorney-client privilege has only found less than 1% of the documents to be privileged?
That is correct. It is a very small fraction, which means his work is, as we've all been calling him, as a fixer.
So not legal work protected by attorney-client privilege. How do you make that distinction?
Well, it's very easy when you are the Judge Jones, who is the special master, and you go through them. It's very clear when someone is seeking legal advice as opposed to business advice or criminal advice. And I don't mean criminal representation. I mean the kind of advice where you work together to commit crimes or to form a deal. One of the big things was Trump Tower in Moscow. That was something that Cohen was working on. Those things are not in any way, shape, or form related to his legal work for Donald Trump.
And, John, today, Ivanka Trump takes a step into the Michael Cohen story by referring the Russian weightlifter to Michael Cohen to talk about the dream of the Trump Tower, Moscow.
Yes, and it's not a story you want to be stepping into. The reasons that we just described, it's not a fairy book kind of narrative that you're stepping into there. For exactly this reason, we all know a lot of lawyers who don't practice law. Like there was a glut of lawyers. A lot of our smart friends went to law school and then decided to become investment bankers, got into business development, did all kinds of stuff. We know tons of people like that. Michael Cohen is sort of like that, except much dumber and not like a really good lawyer who decided not to be a lawyer. And he got into business with Donald Trump. So he got into dirty business, right? He's like the biz dev guy for Enron, right? Who spent his decade running around to skeevy parts of the world where it takes even more dirty stuff to get things built than it does in New York City, and that's saying a lot. And he dealt with nasty people doing stuff just at the edge of or outside the edge of the law to try to make Donald Trump richer by slapping his name onto things that Donald Trump didn't own. That was Michael Cohen's job, and in Trump world, that's a biz dev job. In Ray Donovan world, that's a fixer job. But none of it has anything to do with the law per se. The bigger problem is that the stuff he was doing was not protected by attorney-client privilege, and to go back to the real point, dumb and deeply crooked. I don't mean necessarily, I don't know if he's committed crimes. I'm not saying that. But I mean crooked as in bent. Like, we know people who just are, the rules don't really matter to them all that much. Again, not something that lawyers tend to generally, real lawyers tend to, an attitude they tend to adopt.
So Senator Ron Wyden is saying that he'd like the staff of the Intelligence Committee to interview Ivanka Trump. He said that he would like the staff to do that because there are two separate national security questions they want to talk to her about. But one of them is this connection of the Russian weightlifter to Michael Cohen on the Trump Tower Moscow dream. Presumably, Michael Cohen has somewhere in all that stuff the FBI collected some information about that specifically, and possibly some communication directly from Ivanka Trump to Michael Cohen about that.
Absolutely. And she should be worried about not being 100% accurate. The Russian weightlifter has said, I never had anything to do with anybody from the Trump organization, and yet apparently there are emails. And that disproves that. So she has to be very careful, too, to do exactly what the right thing is. This is all so almost ridiculous. Everybody says you can't make this up. If you did, if you wrote this as a novel, no one would accept it. No publisher would publish it because it's too ridiculous.
I mean, I'm telling you, in the end of this whole thing, this is going to be a story about two buildings. It's going to be a story about Trump Tower Moscow that never came to be, but the quest to try to build it, and 666 Fifth Avenue. And Ivanka Trump's got a husband who's going to be deeply implicated in a lot of shady maneuvers around that building at 666 Fifth Avenue with his father, the Kushner building that's now $1 billion in debt and has led him into all kinds of compromised dealings. And on the other side, this Trump Tower Moscow thing, which, again, the more we hear about it, the more complicated it is, the more compromised it is. It went on a lot further into the campaign than we thought. We now have reporting that takes it all the way up to May or June, when Donald Trump was the de facto Republican nominee, and people like Michael Cohen were still running around trying to get Trump Tower Moscow built. These buildings and the compromises entailed in them are going to be a big part of the story of wherever we land at the end of this, I believe.
But the one thing we have to be careful of, we keep referring to her as the wife of, the daughter of. She is working for the President of the United States. She is a senior advisor to him. And in that role, she has done some things that need to be looked at. So it's not because of her relationship.
Right.
It's because of her activities and her role as a employee, not an unpaid employee, and heaven knows she doesn't need it. She made $82 million this year in income outside of the White House.
A lot of dollar bills, y'all.
So this is a very important point, Jill, I think, that our over-reliance on the descriptor of President's daughter creates a frame on the Ivanka story that would be somewhat different if we simply said a senior advisor of the president, because that's the reason she's in these spots, these investigative spots that she's in.
That's exactly my point. And I think we need to make certain things clear. We have to call things what they are. When he says Spygate, no one should repeat that because there is no such thing. It's a lie-gate, but it's not Spygate. When you call her his daughter, that takes it as sort of like, well, we shouldn't be going after his family. We're not going after his family. We're going after the people who work in the administration, who worked in the campaign. Those are fair game.
She was a campaign operative and is now a White House operative. John Heilemann, thank you for joining our discussion tonight.
Always have a beer.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.